Okay, let's unpack this deep dive. We've got a truly fascinating stack of sources today, really ranging from ancient philosophy all the way to modern critiques of identity in society.
Yeah, this material you've shared gives us a really rich landscape. We're talking equality, discrimination.
Exactly. And how things like race, language, ethnicity intersect with power, social structures, and, just individual experience.
Right. So our mission, really, is to pull out the key insights from this material for you.
Give you that shortcut to understanding these, let's face it, challenging but really crucial ideas. Let's jump right in.
Okay.
We're starting with something incredibly powerful. The intensely personal experience of marginalization. One source gives a really sharp look at the psychological impact of being defined by others.
Especially focusing on the black man in a colonial context.
Right.
And what's fascinating here is how this source describes identity as being shaped not just, from within, but dialogically.
Dialogically.
Yeah, okay.
Like a dialogue.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Think of that word. It means identity is formed through our interactions, our relationships with others, especially in this context, the dominant group.
Okay, so it's like a conversation, but maybe one where one side has most of the power to set the terms.
That's a good way to put it. And this source gives a really striking example with language. It says, and this is powerful, to speak a language is to take on a world, a culture.
Wow.
Absolutely. And it highlights the case of the Antillean Negro who, in this colonial setting, wants to be white. There's this belief, you see, that mastering the white man's language will actually make him whiter.
That's intense linking linguistic skill directly to, well, to race.
It is. And the source notes how deep this goes socially. You have the middle class in the Antilles actively avoiding Creole, their own language.
Their own language.
Yeah. Families even forbid it, teach children to basically scorn the dialect. So it's not just about communication, it's about internalizing this hierarchy where your own culture is seen as inferior.
And the colonizers is seen as superior.
Precisely.
And beyond language, stereotypes clearly play a huge role here too. The source talks about the fear and even sort of desire projected onto the Negro.
Yes, including some deep cultural fears tied into Western ideas about sexuality.
And there's this profound sense the source captures. It calls it being overdetermined from without.
Overdetermined from without. That's a key phrase here.
What does that mean exactly?
It means that your identity feels totally dictated by external forces, by how others see you based purely on their prejudices rather than who you feel you are inside or what you actually do.
Okay.
The source contrasts this with the experience of the Jew, who might sometimes, go unnoticed in their Jewishness, or whose actions are seen as the final determinant.
But for the black man?
The text says he's a slave, not of the idea that others have of him, but of his own appearance.
So just his physical appearance, seen through that lens of prejudice, becomes this inescapable definition.
Exactly. It's a powerful statement about the burden of racial visibility in a prejudiced society. And importantly, the source makes it clear this isn't just about individual psychology.
Right.
It's linked directly to an immediate recognition of social and economic realities.
So the source is arguing that the psychological distress, this feeling of being defined and limited, it's not the cause of the problem.
No, it's presented as a consequence of the oppression. It forcefully rejects that idea that the marginalized person somehow makes themselves inferior.
Right.
The source's point is pretty blunt. The truth is that he is made inferior. The system creates the condition.
And it even draws a line connecting anti-Semitism and anti-Negro sentiment.
Yeah, suggesting that an anti-Semite is inevitably anti-Negro.
Yeah.
It highlights this kind of shared experience of being targeted, of being othered, even if the specific prejudices look different.
Okay, so this source paints a really stark picture of how external power structures, prejudice, can deeply shape personal identity, personal experience. So what does this focus on external definition and social reality mean when we step back? When we think about bigger ideas like, say, justice and social order, let's turn to some of those philosophical perspectives you included.
Right, that's the next question, isn't it? If identity and experience are so shaped by power, how do we even define something like justice? One ancient text you've got here looks at justice in a few ways.
Okay.
It starts with maybe simpler ideas like repaying debts. Being good to friends, harming enemies.
Which, yeah, immediately feels a bit off today, doesn't it?
It does by modern standards, but then this same source introduces a really radical, almost cynical view that justice is simply the interest of the stronger.
Meaning, whatever the powerful say is just, is just.
That's the argument presented. It directly links justice to power, which echoes what you were just saying about marginalization being tied to social and economic realities.
Yeah, it connects.
But interestingly, the same source pushes back against that cynical view. The counterargument comes up that injuring anyone, friend or enemy, is fundamentally not the act of a just person.
Okay, so a different take within the same text.
Exactly. True justice, in this view, is a virtue. Injustice is a vice. And the truly just person, well, they're the one who's actually happy. The ideal state, then, is one where justice prevails, where each part does its proper work.
A perspective rooted in virtue and kind of proper function. Pushing back against might makes right.
Right. And another ancient source you included also links virtue directly to conduct. It says something like, if the will be set on virtue, there will be no practice of wickedness.
So your actions flow from your inner state.
Yes, it offers principles for good governance when the prince is prince. And personal conduct being slow in his speech and earnest in his conduct. It really emphasizes right action flowing from a virtuous disposition.
And it gives a specific guide for how to treat others. Recompense injury with justice, and recompense kindness with kindness, which is different from that harm your enemies idea we heard earlier.
Very different. This one sees virtue as attractive, even saying he who practices it will have neighbors. It draws people in.
Okay, now, you mentioned a striking contrast.
Yes. So here's where another source comes in and really challenges both of those ancient virtue-based views. It offers a genealogy of morality.
A genealogy, like a family tree of moral.
Kind of, yeah. An account of its historical origins. This perspective suggests that the concepts good and bad first arose with the noble or powerful classes. They basically defined the good as, well, themselves, people of the first rank.
So the powerful said, we are good, everyone else is bad.
Essentially. But then this source argues the concepts of good and evil, notice the different word, evil arose later, specifically from what it calls slave morality.
Slave morality.
Yes. And this new morality, it argues, was born out of resentment.
Resentment? Okay, what's that?
It's a key term, often translated as this deep-seated resentment, maybe vengefulness or hostility felt by the weak, the oppressed, against the strong who are causing their suffering.
Wow. So morality isn't some objective truth or inherent virtue in this view, but a reaction born from bitterness and powerlessness.
That's exactly this source's argument. It views resentment as a way to cope with pain, to find a guilty agent to blame for suffering.
Oh, okay.
And it goes further, arguing that the very ideas of just and unjust only come into existence after laws are established. Before laws, this source controversially claims, nothing can be inherently unjust.
Wait, so things like assault, exploitation,
Yeah.
they aren't inherently unjust.
According to this source, no. Because it argues life operates essentially through injury, assault, exploitation, destruction. That's just how life is in this view before we create legal or moral frameworks.
That is a really challenging perspective. It makes you question everything.
It absolutely does. It suggests that what we call justice or morality might just be frameworks created by groups, either the powerful defining themselves as good or the powerless reacting with resentment rather than some kind of universal objective principles.
It forces you to think about where our moral ideas even come from and how much they might be tied up with power and psychology.
Definitely. It's a radical reevaluation.
Okay, so we've looked at the deep personal impact of marginalization, these really different philosophical takes on justice and morality, virtue, power, resentment. How does society itself, its structure, its pressures relate to all this, especially that tension between the individual and the group?
Well, one source really focuses on what it calls the tyranny of opinion.
The tyranny of opinion.
Yeah. This is where the majority's likes and dislikes essentially become law, or at least these incredibly powerful social rules that everyone feels they have to follow.
Like unwritten rules you break at your peril. Social pressure.
Exactly that. And this source argues strongly for the value of diversity of opinion as a kind of counterforce to this tyranny.
Why is diversity so important here?
Because, it points out, popular opinions are rarely the whole truth. Often what are considered heretical opinions, the unpopular ones actually contain important, neglected truths that the majority is missing.
And the source gives the historical struggle for religious liberty as a key example, right?
Yeah.
People asserting their individual right to believe differently against huge societal pressure.
Precisely. A classic case of pushing back against that tyranny of opinion. The source argues society's power should really be limited. It can justly punish acts that actually harm others' rights.
Okay, direct harm.
Yeah. And maybe even punished by opinion like social disapproval for acts that are hurtful or inconsiderate without actually being illegal. But crucially, conduct that only affects oneself, that should have perfect freedom, legal and social.
Total freedom if it doesn't harm others. This connects really interestingly to another source you included, the one discussing modern individualism and authenticity.
It does. That source notes the modern ideal is often about being true to one's own original self, finding your unique path.
Which sounds good.
It does, but it adds a crucial warning. It suggests that pursuing self-fulfillment without any regard for our ties to others, or for demands that come from something more or other than human desires, can actually be self-defeating.
Self-defeating. Why? How?
Because, the source argues, we can't escape our horizon of significance.
Horizon of significance.
Think of it like the background against which everything makes sense. We need that context. We can't define ourselves or find meaning in a total vacuum. Our identity, our values, they take shape against the backdrop of our culture, our relationships, our shared understanding of what's important or good.
So trying to be totally original, completely authentic, without any reference to that shared world, it just doesn't work. It doesn't lead to real fulfillment.
That's the argument. You need that horizon. The source actually brings this up in the context of contemporary discussions around things like non-standard sexual orientations and the language of difference, diversity, multiculturalism. It's grappling with how we assert unique identities within a shared social context and whether focusing only on individual authenticity risks losing that necessary background, that horizon.
It's interesting, though, because both sources, despite coming at it differently, seem to highlight a similar danger in modern society. And it's not too much individuality.
No, counterintuitively, it's a deficiency. People can lose the capacity for strong personal desires, for native pleasures, just by conforming to custom all the time.
They conform so much, the source says, it doesn't even occur to them to want anything except what's customary.
Exactly. They lose the sort of muscle for independent thought and desire.
And this is where eccentricity comes in, right?
Yeah.
The source sees it as valuable.
Very valuable. A necessary counterforce to this stifling conformity and the tyranny in opinion. Just the example of someone daring to be different serves a purpose.
It reminds others that alternatives exist.
Precisely. That independent thought and action are actually possible.
Okay, so we've got the personal impact, the philosophical debates about justice and power, societal pressure versus individual difference. How do the structures themselves, the systems we live in, how do they perpetuate inequality? And importantly, how might they be resisted or changed, according to these sources?
Well, one source connects the exploitation faced by the black man very directly, not just to individual prejudice, but to a whole system. It calls it a colonialist-capitalist society that is only accidentally white.
Only accidentally white. What does that mean?
It means the fundamental problem, in this view, is systemic economic exploitation inherent in colonialism and capitalism. Race is used as a tool within that system, but the underlying driver is the exploitative structure itself.
So the inequality is baked into the structure. It's not just about attitudes.
Yes, exactly. And another source offers a different, maybe more abstract take. It views legal conditions, social orders, as potentially limiting what it calls the will of life, which is bent upon power.
The will of life.
Yeah.
Bent upon power.
Yeah. It even controversially suggests that a legal order designed to prevent all forms of struggle or competition could actually be seen as hostile to life's inherent drive from a certain biological standpoint.
That perspective seems to echo that earlier idea we discussed, the one about life operating through injury or exploitation before laws exist, suggesting maybe structures that try to eliminate all striving might be unnatural in a way.
It definitely presents a challenging view on the nature of order versus conflict, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And related to structures, one source gives us that classic analysis of how a state can descend into tyranny. It outlines a process of structural breakdown.
How does that happen?
It often starts, the source says, by a leader creating a party specifically against the wealthy, which fuels social division. This leads to violence, purges, and ultimately a single ruler emerges who becomes like a wolf, preying on the very people they're supposed to protect.
A chilling picture of structural collapse leading to oppression. So, given these powerful structures, how do the sources suggest they can be resisted?
One source talks about the politics of resistance as fundamentally being the politics of democratic will formation.
Democratic will formation.
Yeah. It emphasizes the crucial need to resist fragmentation in society, all the things that divide people, and actively work to reverse it, to bring people together.
So countering division and building some kind of collective will is key.
Exactly. It suggests that successful common action people acting together for a shared goal is incredibly important. It can lead to empowerment. It can strengthen people's identification with the broader political community.
And that combats that feeling of powerlessness and alienation we talked about earlier.
Precisely. It counters that vicious cycle where people feel overwhelmed by external forces. And of course, that earlier point about the value of non-conformity.
Right. Asserting individual rights against the tyranny of opinion, like the religious liberty example.
That absolutely fits here too. It's another form of resistance against dominant social norms and structures.
Hmm.
And the source presents it almost as a service to society, especially when conformity is running high.
So resistance can look like collective action, building democratic will, but also like individual acts of nonconformity and asserting difference.
Yes, these sources suggest pushing back against oppressive structures and norms can happen on multiple levels, both collective and individual.
Wow. Okay, we have covered a tremendous amount of ground here. Drawing from these really diverse sources to get at the many facets of equality and discrimination.
We really have. We've seen that profound psychological impact of being defined by stereotypes and colonial structures, how language itself is a tool, how identity is so deeply shaped by external forces.
And we explored those philosophical ideas of justice, contrasting the ancient virtue views with, justice as the interest of the stronger, and that really challenging idea that maybe good and evil came from the resentment of the oppressed.
Right. And we grappled with that tension between individual liberty, that modern ideal of authenticity, and the huge pressure of societal conformity, questioning the limits of authority, seeing the value in being different.
And finally, we touched on the structures, the systems that perpetuate inequality, like colonial economies, power dynamics, fragmentation, but also ideas of resistance through democratic action, common action, and just asserting individual rights and nonconformity.
These sources, when you put them together, they really push you to think hard about where our ideas of morality, justice, identity even come from, and how deeply they're all intertwined with power, with social structures, with psychological responses to suffering, and that whole complex relationship between the individual and the group.
It's a lot to take in. And these sources offer such different, sometimes conflicting lenses on the problem of inequality. We've looked at the deeply personal, the philosophical, the societal layers. Here's something to think about, drawing from one of those sources. If concepts we feel are fundamental, like guilt or maybe even psychological pain, might themselves be interpretations of deeper physiological states or facts that are actually hard to pin down or put into words, what does that imply? What does it imply about our understanding of the experiences of those who face systemic discrimination? Are we always truly understanding the underlying reality? Or are we sometimes, perhaps unconsciously, just imposing our own interpretations maybe shaped by those very power dynamics and social structures we've been discussing? It's definitely something to mull over.